Welcome to the Jonathan Van Bilsen Show, featuring lively, in-depth conversation with compelling guests from our community. And here is our host, Jonathan Van Bilsen.
Welcome. Our guest today is no stranger to broadcasting. He was on our show several months ago when we talked about his latest book, Rush to Danger. It's only fitting that we bring him back for our Remembrance Day show. Please welcome Ted Barris. Ted, good to see you again.
Thank you. Nice to be back. Thanks for the invitation.
On our last visit, we talked about your life, which is certainly very interesting. You're a broadcaster with CBC, with CTV, TVO, and many, many more, a professor at Centennial College teaching journalism, a columnist, and of course a best-selling author. With a very unique genre, Canadian history, or more so Canadians in areas of turmoil around the globe. Of the 19 books that you've published, I want to go back to the very, very first one, a story that takes us back to Canada's steamship days. It was called Fire Canoe?
Yep.
And I'm curious how you get into a subject about steamships.
Well, when I first went west to sort of begin to discover the country as a young journalist in the early 1970s, I landed in Saskatoon, was working at the University of Saskatchewan, and a friend of mine, a guy I was working with, a guy named Alan Bradley, who later became a novelist himself, he showed me a photograph that looked as if it had been taken on the Mississippi or the Ohio River in about 1850. Big, 200-foot long, multi-decked, flat-bottomed, twin smokestack steamboat, paddle wheels. And I thought, wow, that's a Mississippi steamer. He said, nope, that was a photograph taken at Fort Edmonton in 1879. I said, you mean here on the prairies in Saskatchewan and Alberta? He said, yes. I was intrigued. And he prompted and prodded me to go and do the research. And this is back in the 70s when many of the people who had been in the steamboat industry before the turn of the 19th century to the 20th century were still alive. Right. So I went scampering all across what is now Manitoba, Saskatchewan, Alberta, then was the Rupert's Land, and the domain of the Hudson's Bay Company, and I explored the lives of the people who were on the steamboats, essentially the people who built them, the stevedores who worked on them, the captains and the pilots who commanded them, the passengers who traveled, who came from all parts of the world to move into the West. This is before the CPR opened up the West, as it were.
Right.
The steamboats were there 15 years before the CPR was. Anyway, great history, wonderfully colorful stories, very much like Mark Twain's experiences on the Mississippi, but transposed to Canada. So I just knew that had to be done and had never been written before, jumped into it, and found as many sources as I could and put together this book. It was great fun. I enjoyed it.
What was it like doing your very first book, getting it published?
Scary as hell.
I know it took me 11 years to get mine published from the time I wrote it.
Well, your endurance level is much, and your ability to withstand all that is better than mine. I was very fortunate. By accident, when I was doing the work on Fire Canoe, I actually submitted an application to get some money from the Canada Council, and they gave me a prince's ransom. I think I got $5,270.
Wow.
In 1972.
That's a lot of money.
It was then.
That's a lot of money.
To do the research on the book. Well, when the figure and my name were published in a paper in the West, I think in Calgary, a guy from Calgary contacted me. He was an editor with McClellan and Stewart. He said, have you got a publisher for the new book? I said, I haven't written it yet. And they said, well, let's keep in touch. Turned out to be M&S was very interested. And wonderful coincidence, Pierre Burton, who was an idol of mine and a colleague, I knew him as one of this country's great popular historians, he actually told the editorial board at McClellan and Stewart, we must publish this book.
Really?
So I had the hand of God come down
quite the endorsement.
And give me a break. It was great fun.
Yeah, no, I didn't have that luxury. Pierre Burton didn't call me back.
No, you went through the school of hard knocks.
Rejection is my second name. The title, Fire Canoe, if you could just give us a little bit of background as to where that comes from.
Well, the research, which took my wife, Jane McCauley, and me across Manitoba, Saskatchewan, Alberta, we actually began in Winnipeg. And for some strange reason, wonderful coincidence, the Hudson's Bay Company had just released literally skids and skids worth of research from the head offices in London in the 1970s, had shipped them out to Manitoba, and they were literally arriving, the skids, at the provincial archives. So Jane and I had access to brand new, unexplored research on steamboat activity in the West. We were going through countless files and documents and photographs and backgrounders and so on, and Jane tripped over a dictionary with that was written by a translator of the Plains Cree language.
Okay.
And in it was a phrase, I'll probably massacre it, but it was something like Puska Patu Usi, which translated to English was the Plains Cree word for steamboat. They referred to a steamboat as a fire canoe. A canoe with fire coming out of it.
That makes
Very
sense.
logical.
Very logical.
So we had to use it as the title.
Of course. One of my favorite books that you've written is The Dam Busters. I have a copy of it here, as a matter of fact. It was obviously the film The Dam Busters, which came out in the 50s, which I thoroughly enjoyed. I had no idea that Canadians were involved in that entire project.
Which is why I wrote the book.
Exactly. And you may want to just back up a little bit to explain what exactly the Dam Busters and how they used the bombs and the problems they faced.
Okay. This is Second World War now, and we're talking about a period between late 1942 and early 43 when the war was not going well for the Allies. The Blitz was happening in England. The Japanese had just bombed Pearl Harbor in late 41, so the Americans were now trying to recover from that. The Canadians had gone through the horror of Dieppe in August of 1942, so we were still getting our balance and trying to turn the tide. The Allies knew that they had to do something extraordinary to make sure that the Nazis knew that they were up against an appropriate foe.
Right.
By coincidence, a man named Barnes Wallis, who was a magical engineer, came up with a concept of a bouncing bomb that might attack the great dams of the Ruhr River Valley. His concept was, let's not destroy the tanks and the aircraft and the submarines, let's destroy the ability of the Nazis to build them. Meaning, if you could get at the industrial power or the power that powered the industries, i.e. the hydroelectric dams on the Ruhr Valley, we could eliminate the construction of all that weaponry. So a bomb had to be delivered along the Ruhr Valley to the dams over torpedo nets, which the Germans had installed to protect them. And so it had to skip over the water. So it was a bouncing bomb. And it had to be delivered by a large aircraft, and the Lancasters were just coming off the line, able to handle one 10,000-pound bomb per aircraft. And so 19 Lancasters on the 16th of May, 1943, took off flying low level, below 100 feet. Look out your window and look at a 90-foot pine tree and imagine a Lancaster traveling for 2.5 hours from England to Germany at that level so it could go under the radar. The Germans wouldn't know they were there, attack the dams, and get back with the bouncing bomb. That's what they did.
That's it's quite the flying skill.
And at dear cost. Of the 11 Lancs that went out that night, only 11 came back. It was a horrific cost.
Sorry, how many went out?
19.
19 went out. Wow, that's amazing. And there would have been what, 6, 7, 8 people crew?
There were 8-man crews. They had a pilot, a flight engineer who was able to fly the plane, a navigator, a bomb aimer, a
couple of gunners,
wireless radio operator, and 2 gunners, one in the front and one in the rear. So that's 7 men.
I remember from the film, which was probably very Hollywoodized, but somebody was walking along the beach and saw a child throwing a stone, skipping across the water, and that's where he got the idea.
Well, that's where Wallace essentially borrowed the idea. In fact, he the engineer who designed the bombs, he said that he actually learned it from Admiral Nelson, who was the British naval officer at the Battle of Trafalgar. Apparently, Nelson used to skip some of the shells that he fired from the Victory on the top of the water against the French ships.
Really? Wow.
And so that concept of the skip was what he was thinking of. And if you skip a stone on a lake in the summertime, same concept. But what he didn't know until a cricketer told him, this is Barnes Wallis, was if you spin the stone, it propels the stone faster and more directly at the target. So the spinning bomb, not just the dropped bomb, but a spinning, and the bomb, which ultimately became a sort of a barrel effect, had to be spinning at 500 revolutions per minute backwards in order to get there.
And they weren't able to simply fly over and drop the bomb?
No, because the bomb had to be dropped, skipped over the torpedo nets, and then while rotating backwards, hit the backside of the dam and sink down into the water, and then explode like a depth charge.
So it was timed?
Yes.
And where would they have, obviously they didn't do this the first time around, they had a few trials with this.
Well, they only trained for 7.5 weeks. This is the amazing thing. They trained over areas around England. There were people who learned to hate the low-level flyers of the RAF because they kept going over their houses and their farms and creating a ruckus and a racket in early 1943. But eventually at the end of 7.5 weeks, the crews didn't know. There were 133 crewmen in the Lancasters that went. None of the crewmen knew until days before what the target was.
Oh, okay. So it was very confidential, obviously. Kept very secret.
Yeah.
And of the 19 planes that went, over what period of time are we talking? And how many dams are we talking?
They attacked 4 dams, and it was in one night.
It was all in the Ruhr River?
All in the Ruhr, yeah.
Okay.
And they had to do it in one night and get back, because once they attacked one dam, the jig was up.
Right.
The Nazis knew what they were up to.
So the ones that didn't make it they perished because of enemy fire?
Yes, and they were shot down. A couple of them ran into. One of the big problems they had flying into occupied Europe was getting around all the high tension wires.
Right.
If you're down at 100 feet off the deck at 235 miles an hour, suddenly you're upon a high tension wire. You got to go under it, over it, and some of them didn't manage to get either.
Yes, just
an extraordinary story. But what's amazing, and you pointed at your initial question, is that of the 133 men, a quarter of them were Canadians.
Right.
And the movie, made by the British, doesn't mention them. You'll see the odd Canada patch on an actor's uniform in the movie, but that's it. They don't get any speaking roles. But Canadians were prominent. They were scattered all across the 19 crews as pilots and navigators and flight engineers and bomb aimers and wireless radio operators and gunners. All of them had Canadian content.
Which is what's so great about your book. It really brings it close to home. We do have a fantastic story to tell in this country.
We do.
And it's so good that you do put it out. Because you lived in Saskatchewan and Alberta, was there sort of an attraction to writing about opening up the West?
Yeah, you know yourself that a writer is always looking for a story that's never been told. Mm-hmm. And so the story I told you a moment ago about having landed in Saskatchewan and starting work there, and this friend of mine, Alan Bradley, showing me the photograph, I was intrigued. But what I realized was that it was really an exploration of the world that I had suddenly jumped into.
Okay.
Living in Saskatchewan, I had never lived on the prairies before. I never considered prairies, water, steamboats as ever being used in the same sentence.
Right.
But discovered otherwise, and so pursued it. And it was a great story, and I loved it.
Just quickly before the break, I wanted to ask, your latest book, Push to Danger, is based on the medics in wartime, and a large part of that, of course, is your father, who was a medic in wartime. He was also one of the original panelists on Front Page Panel, if I'm not mistaken, with CBC back when it came out.
Right.
Now, was it easy to get information from him for your book, or like a lot of veterans, did he sort of keep it to himself?
Very good question. Every family I talk to says the same thing when it comes to trying to get the stories from dad or granddad or grandmother or mother. They didn't want to talk about it.
Right.
Oddly, as a stranger coming into a veteran's life, I have a different tack, and also they treat me differently. Somehow they sense that they don't have to worry if they're feeling vulnerable or if they break down.
Right.
They're not breaking down in front of a son or a daughter or a grandchild. But I come in, I set up my recorder, we talk much as you and I are doing here in conversation. I know the subject, I begin to needle away at getting the details, and bit by bit they give me the details, because they know at the end of it, I turn off my recorder, we shake hands, I'm gone.
Excellent. Our guest today for this Remembrance Day show is Mr. Ted Barris. We'll be back in a few minutes to talk more about his books. I'm Jonathan Van Bilsen, and I've had the opportunity to spend my life traveling and photographing exotic locales around the world. Thanks to Rogers TV, I'm now able to share my adventures with you on my show, Photos and Travel, right here on Rogers TV. Welcome back. Broadcaster, professor, columnist, and very successful author Ted Barris is here to talk with us about some of the 19 books on Canadian history, mostly as it relates to war. This is very fitting during this Remembrance Day show. Ted, welcome back.
Nice to be here. Thanks, Jonathan.
I wanted to talk about a book that you wrote called The Great Escape, the True Story. It's an interesting book. The movie was fantastic. I mean, I love the movie. I know it's very factual. Steve McQueen in the cooler with his glove really happened.
No.
What I found very interesting about your book is that it's an untold story because there were a lot of Canadians involved in that project, which of course Hollywood tended to forget.
Well, let's roll back the film here.
Okay.
It's 1950 when the first Great Escape book written by Paul Brickhill is completed. Mm-hmm. And a guy named John Burgess, who's a director-producer in Hollywood, acquires the property. Cost him a lot of money. He knew that this was a great story. That this is the story of the escape from a Polish prisoner of war camp where airmen who had been captured by the Luftwaffe and in fact were being guarded by the Luftwaffe are held in this camp in western Poland, a place called Zagon. Okay, so he gets this property, John Sturgis does, and he knows that the way to make this into a blockbuster movie is to Americanize it. because you want to get American audiences, who are your largest audience, to come in the door, pay big money at the box office, and see their hunks, the heroes of Hollywood, in these roles. So it was Americanized, and for that purpose. In fact, there was no Steve McQueen role. There was no guy who was the baseball guy in the cooler. There was, however, a digger who wasn't Charles Bronson, the guy who they characterize as, I think, a Polish American in the RAF. The guy who designed the tunnels was Wally Floody from Chatham, Ontario.
Really?
The guy who was the forgery chief, was not Donald Pleasance, the guy who goes blind in the movie.
Yep. Oh, I remember that. You're really shooting this down for me now.
Well, it's okay, but the role was there. It's just that there was a nationality change here. So it wasn't a Brit who was the forgery chief. The forgery chief was a guy named Tony Pengelly from Truro, Nova Scotia.
Really?
The guy who was in charge of intelligence was not the British character that is depicted in the movie. Donald Jackson, I think his name is, the actor. In fact, the guy in charge of intelligence was also from Nova Scotia, and he was a journalist. So when you go back through the history, you find the tunnel designer, the tunnel diggers, the forgery chief, the diversions chief, the guy who was in charge of much of the activity to disguise the documents and the tailoring that was used for the uniforms and so on. All of these roles were Canadians. But Hollywood saw them as Americans to draw the audience.
That makes sense. They still do that.
It made sense.
They haven't changed that. There's a little bit of reference to someone from North Durham, from Port Perry, a fellow named Dave Zink, who sadly passed away a few years ago, who gave you a lot of information, or some information, to start this book rolling.
Yeah, some of your viewers will remember Dave, who ran the Militaria store in downtown Port Perry at the old Memorial Library.
The old library, that's right.
And Dave was an extraordinary man for detail and care and concern and consideration for veterans. He had a great library, he had a great artifacts library, and he was very sympathetic to writers such as myself when I was beginning that story. He found for me documentation I didn't even know existed. We all know at the end of the movie, when all these guys are recaptured, that a number of them are murdered. And the way it's depicted in the movie is kind of whitewashed. At the end of the movie, they throw them into trucks, the guys who've been recaptured, and they're hauling them back to the Stalag Luft 3. And they stop along the way, allow them to get out to relieve themselves and to stretch. They set up machine guns and mow them down. It didn't happen that way. The document that Dave gave me shows how the guys who were complicit in the murders of the 50 officers after the Great Escape were actually Gestapo thugs who were brought in, and these guys were taken out in 2s and 3s and murdered, and their remains cremated and sent back to the camp. That data was not known until many years later, and in that document that Dave somehow got, he didn't tell me where he got it, but it's an RAF official document which had never been published, and it offers how those men were killed and who did it.
Wow. He was, he was quite the gentleman. I know he would have coffee once a week at Hank's with a bunch of people around the same genre, and I would sit at the next table and I'd overhear some of these stories that were just matter-of-fact things that I thought were just spectacular. But sadly, he was very sadly missed.
He really cared about history.
He really did. Yeah. So I was recently in South Korea, and I bring that up because of your book on Korea,
Deadlock in Korea,
and the role that Canadians played. And I remember looking at some of the countryside, which of course now is very picturesque and very very populated, and where the fighting took place, and it really brought it back home. So how did you get into the research for it? Because Korea to me has always been an American war, and again,
certainly their story,
absolutely. Well, Hollywood makes the movies, and that's what people believe, right?
Yeah, Pork Chop Hill and other, and of course, don't forget MASH. Was actually rooted in or depicted as a Korean War phenomenon. So Americans have a much more vivid sense of it. But the story, I actually didn't go to Korea. I had enough money to travel across Canada to meet the veterans, and I interviewed somewhere close to 500 Canadians who had served in Korea. Along the way, I bumped into the Korea Veterans Association of Canadians, and they offered me their archives, doubled my archive. I had 1,000 voices. So I went back and I literally retraced the steps of all the Canadians and all the services: Army, Navy, Air Force, transport, artillery, tanks, nurses, medical facilities, entertainers, all of the Canadians who were involved in serving the Canadian cause. There were 27,000 Canadians who served in Korea. Most people don't realize that. But it's a great story, and in fact, the Korea Veterans Association endorsed my book, Deadlock in Korea, as the definitive book of the Canadian experience there. So I was very proud of that.
Mm-hmm. So the research was primarily from
Firsthand.
interviewing people.
Yeah, people who were there.
And that's the way to have it. I mean, that's certainly the way to do it. I wanted to talk a little bit about first responders and primarily PTSD, which
post-traumatic stress disorder.
Yeah, or syndrome. You and I were at a breakfast in Ottawa a couple of years ago, which I believe it's a regular yearly event hosted by MP Aaron O'Toole and former Senator Romeo Dallaire.
It's called the Sam Sharp Breakfast.
That's right. That's right. And I wanted to ask if maybe you could just relay a little bit about Sam Sharp as a sort of a preface to the PTSD.
It's an extraordinary story and one that we haven't really explored very well. Particularly as pertains to younger veterans coming home from Bosnia and Rwanda, Somalia and Afghanistan and Iraq and so on. Sam Sharp was a lawyer and an MP in Uxbridge, Ontario, around the turn of the 19th century, so just leading up to the Great War. And he realized that local battalions were important to service the Commonwealth armies, that the expeditionary forces that were serving on the Western Front. And so he mounts a battalion in Ontario County, what is now Durham Region, roughly. 116th Battalion. He pays for it. He gets its uniforms, arms them, gives them all their training in the woods just outside Uxbridge. I could show you where it all, the training, the marksmanship fields and the marksmanship training areas were. And then he actually leads the army, the 116th, in battle. Because he did, and because he saw his battalion decimated, he suffered from what was then referred to as shell shock. The man was depleted emotionally because he saw his battalion cut to ribbons. Of the roughly 1,600 men who went overseas, only 160 returned.
Wow.
He couldn't take that, and he was shipped home early, and he took his own life. And so his record was expunged. Can you imagine that? They took his record, as admirable as it was, and threw it away, and it made him invisible. Well, for the past 10 years, we've been rebuilding his reputation, making sure that he was recognized, not just as a great leader, not just as a colonel who led his battalion, but as a man who was reelected to Parliament while he was serving overseas in the Great War.
Yeah, it's amazing what the attitude of people was. I know that his portrait, actually, I believe it hung in the high school, and it was slashed, if I'm not mistaken.
Oh, it's possible.
And has since been repaired, and it's now hanging in the officers' mess in Oshawa.
And Tyler Briley, who is the man who created a bust, which will one day be set in Centre Block on Parliament Hill, has been instrumental in his whole campaign to restore his reputation.
I was at the ceremony when they put it up just prior to closing Centre Block.
Yeah,
it's a beautiful.
It will repair a piece of history that's been lost.
Yeah. People never talk about, or people don't want to talk about PTSD. It's something that's hidden, and there's so many stories. The book that you have written about that, which is
Breaking the Silence.
Breaking the Silence. Sorry, it talks about veterans. Now, was it difficult to research that book? Like, how difficult was it to get information from people?
Well, it was sort of an accumulative book. I gathered stories from, I even way back was able to interview very elderly First World War veterans going back to the 60s. Obviously, Second World War, Korean War, Vietnam, and so on and so forth. It takes patience. Very quick story. I interviewed a young man who had been at the friendly fire incident in Afghanistan. This is an incident where the Americans bombed the Canadians who were training at Tarnak Farms in 2002. I invited him to my home one night, and we sat across the table, and he brought out a bag, and he put on the table handwritten answers to the questions he expected I would ask him. He was that worried that he had to stay within the bounds of what he knew. He had gone through that horrific bombing and survived. He took shrapnel in his hand and his face. Anyway, so I start asking questions, and he picks up the paper and reads the answers. My job was to find a question for which there wasn't an answer on the paper, and I found one. About maybe an hour into the interview, I asked him, I said, what did the bomb sound like? And he looked off in space as if to say, I don't have an answer written down. He said, you're going to laugh? I said, try me. He said, it sounded like that anvil that comes down from heaven in those Wile E. Coyote cartoons, where it goes, bam, and he went like that. And he laughed, and I didn't.
Yeah.
And he opened the door, and I got stories about what it was like to be there that he hadn't planned on answering. Patience, patience, patience.
Yeah, it's you can't put yourself in the shoes of people like that. I spoke with Mark Burney, who's the fire chief for Skewgog Township, and they're doing a big initiative to help first responders get through traumatic situations.
We're building. Tyler Briley has designed another sculpture which will be put in front of the fire hall in Uxbridge at some point later this year.
Another book written on the 60th anniversary of the Liberation of the Netherlands, which is, of course, very, very dear to my heart, being born there. My father was in the Dutch underground and then was in a camp in Dusseldorf for 2 years. So obviously,
as a forced laborer.
Well,
anyone who has taken the opportunity to travel to Europe in the years since the war knows that the Italians are grateful for Canadians liberating them, and the Belgians and the French, but nobody, I mean nobody, cares as much or as honorably or as deeply about the liberation of their country as do the Dutch. The Canadians lost probably 10,000 soldiers in the liberation of the Netherlands. And you go any cemetery anywhere, and I've been there now 8 or 10 times, anywhere you go, if you say you're Canadian, you don't even have to be a veteran. You don't have to have anything to do with it. They worship the ground you stand on because for them, Canadians are their liberators. And it's an extraordinary experience because they share that passion to pay back and to recognize what the Canadians gave them was something that we never lost during the war. They lost their freedom. You know that from your family.
Very much so.
And the Canadians restored it.
Ted, thank you very, very much for being part of our Remembrance Day show. I'd like to thank you all for watching. We'll see you next month.